Hi everyone, welcome to the neck, upper back, and shoulder curriculum created by myself and Peter Attia.
We decided to start with the shoulders, neck, and upper back because so many people that we take care of experience injuries here. And I think part of it stems from an artifact of evolution. So most people are pretty aware that their hip is a very stable ball and socket joint. And we're pretty fortunate in that we, through our evolution, learned to stand up, and in the process basically traded stability for flexibility. So in exchange for being able to throw a spear, we had to give up a lot of stability here. So the first thing to keep in mind when you think about your shoulder is this joint doesn't behave like a typical ball and socket joint. And Jesse will explain a little bit about what the glenoid fossa does and how the humerus is stabilized there. But the point to remember is you have a series of muscles that are doing a lot of the work that would be done by a typical socket elsewhere in the body. The second thing to keep in mind is if it weren't enough that we figured out a way to stand up and chuck spears, we've now, in the last few years, done something even more unnatural for which evolution hasn't given us enough time to catch up, which is we have now learned to do this. So we hunch over, we type, we look at screens, we look down, and that is something we just haven't had any time to cope with. And so we see a typical set of injuries where the posterior chain, the muscles in the back, tend to be locked long. They also tend to be very weak. And as that happens, you transmit that weakness to other muscles.
Now, we're going to focus on 4 different specific aspects of the upper back and neck and shoulder. The first is just the range of motion of the neck. The neck is extremely mobile. If you don't use it, you lose it. So we're going to work on not only increasing range, but making sure that that neck and head can stay centered over the body so you're not getting all that upper trap and neck pain. The next one we're going to focus on is the actual glenoid fossa. This is an extremely mobile and shallow joint, unlike the hip, which is a deep and strong structural joint. So with the glenoid fossa, we're not going to do a lot of overhead pressing, but we will strengthen it in the overhead range. And the reason we're going to strengthen the overhead range is we also want to focus on the AC joint. This is where the shoulder mostly becomes impinged around the acromion roof, and the AC joint is responsible for allowing pivot and rotation and flexion and extension, but most importantly, it's the last stabilizer in an overhead reach. So this is actually one of the first things that starts to degenerate. So working that AC process and strengthening it in that end range is going to help your pain in the front part of the shoulder. And the last thing and the most important area we're going to work on is something called the scapula. The scapula is your shoulder blade that's free floats, it doesn't have any attachments, and it basically glides along the rib cage. Now, the scapula is innervated by many muscles, the trapezius, rhomboids, pec minor, shoulder rotator cuff, and basically if any of those other muscles around it are impinged or asymmetrical, the scapula is not going to move well. And that's important because the scapula is actually what saves the shoulder blade as the conduit of force. So the scapula is responsible for transferring force into the trunk, and the trunk transfers force into the scapula. So if you have a nice rhythm where the scapula is moving in rhythm with your shoulder blade, all the force of daily living and exercise is going to be transferred into that scapula, into that core, versus into that shoulder.
When you look at athletes who really have to use their shoulders, swimmers would come to mind, incredible scapular flexibility. People often talk about the amount of reach that a great swimmer like Michael Phelps can generate in the scapula. This is the reason why. It's to be able to catch water high and pull without loading the shoulder. You have to be able to use the scapula. So whether or not you're a swimmer, Jesse and I are pretty convinced you're going to get a lot of value out of these movements in this sequence.